if you kind of take out a lot of the sort of support that Ukraine is getting, what you get is probably not a swift Russian victory, right? What you get is a much more extensive Russian occupation and an internal Ukrainian guerrilla insurgency, right? So it's much more like a kind of Vietnam War or the Soviet war in Afghanistan style operation. Those were not quick wars. They were even bloodier, longer, more problematic conflict. So although, you know, I consider myself a very anti-war person and I'm not hugely in favor of the arms trade, but this is a context in which I think things would be even worse if Western support for Ukraine wasn't forthcoming.
Alongside an actual war that is fought on the battleground, there is always an informational war going on about the conflicting parties. The same is obviously true for the war between Ukraine and Russia. But whom can we trust? Which information is more accurate? And what are the sources we can inform ourselves about the war? To answer these questions, I invited a lecturer of international politics at the King's College London, Jonathan Leader-Maynard. Jonathan, I'm very happy to talk with you about those questions and to find out whom we can trust.
Yeah, delighted to join you. Thanks.
Jonathan, for you, propaganda and informational wars has always been an interesting topic. And today we talk about Russia and Ukraine. Many Russians tell me that they believe the Russian media, and many Westerners tell me they believe the Western media. But how can we know in the West that those horrors of war are actually committed by Russia and not by the Ukrainians?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm really glad that you sort of picked this as the place to start our conversation today, because, as you say, to some extent, this is a feature of all human history, but we live in a world in which kind of misinformation and competing narratives and polarization is becoming a much more prevalent feature of world politics. And I understand a lot of people's hesitancy to go along with, as it were, the kind of narratives of one side, right? Indeed, I would sort of say to anyone thinking about the Ukraine conflict, or indeed any aspect of world politics, don't believe things just because governments say that they are so, right? Or indeed don't just believe things that originally come from governments uncritically. Governments have all sorts of vested interests and ideological agendas and purposes and causes that they're serving. On their own, they're not particularly reliable sources of information. And so, you know, I think very few people should come to any conclusions on the war in Ukraine because, say, you know, the United States government or the British government says that this is so. Equally, I think they should obviously, for very obvious reasons, be very suspicious of anything that the Russian government says is so, right? These governments are not reliable sources. And to some extent, that extends to media organizations as well, right? So there are obviously very, very strong reasons to distrust Russian media. The Russian media environment in Russia is incredibly restricted. Opposition media have largely been shut down. Critical voices face persecution or being expelled from their careers, as has happened to a number of Russian journalists who protested on television or radio or in print about the war. So obviously, I think there are fairly self-evident reasons why people should be very suspicious of what Russian media tells them about the conflict. But to a slightly lesser extent, that does extend to Western media as well, right? Western media also have often an ideological leaning or bias. And I would be hard pressed to find any organization, any media organization for you, where I would say, oh, this media organization has never published a misleading story ever, right, on international politics. That does obviously happen. But the thing I think people need to, the first thing I think anyone should realize about these conflicts is that we all are dependent to some extent on other people for the information that we get, right? So we all should be thinking critically about information. There's no source of information which we shouldn't be thinking critically about. And I think particularly with a big stakes conflict like Ukraine, neutrality isn't really an option, right? You can remain kind of neutral on the conflict to some extent, but that's still a choice, right? That's still a position to take up. So we've all got to kind of think about where is our information coming from, how reliable is it, and how trustworthy is it? And the reason why I would say that people should generally be somewhat, you know, largely recognize that what is being reported in Western media is an accurate, generally accurate, not perfect, but generally accurate image of the conflict in Ukraine, is that you're not really trusting the Western media, right? You're not really trusting Western media organizations, or at least that shouldn't be the source of authority really for you here. What we should be trusting here is what we might call the transnational analyst community, right? And by that, I mean the network of journalists, non-governmental organizations, United Nations agencies, scholars like myself at universities all around the world. And when I say all around the world, I really mean that. I don't just mean in kind of Britain and Germany and America, right? Latin America, Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, India. You know, we have this huge network of people who collect information, observe information, and analyze information about the war in Ukraine. And that, in my view, is the best that we have in terms of who should we trust. It's that transnational community of analysts that we should really trust. And in open societies, to use kind of the philosopher Karl Popper's phrase, societies where there are not very strong restrictions, as there are in Russia at the moment, on free speech, on free research, on the status of academics or journalists, and so on and so forth. While an individual organization might not necessarily be that trustworthy, the kind of overarching conversation that goes on is something that we should put a lot of faith in, right? If the United States government releases some satellite images and they're fakes, then media organizations, analysts like myself, I mean, satellite images is not my area of expertise, but people in my position whom that is their expertise, they can very quickly say, these are fakes. We have analyzed these, we've used video technology. The BBC, for example, has done quite a lot of work trying to verify photographs and video coming out of the Ukrainian conflict. If the BBC is lying, equally, some scholars or academics or NGOs can get on board and say, look, this is wrong. So there is this open conversation that takes place between individuals who largely are not directly under the control of governments, right? And while I would say any individual media organization, you might still have varying degrees of skepticism of, when you have narratives that have a very, very strong degree of consensus coming out of that transnational community, that's something that we should really put a lot of trust in, or at least I would say it's the most trustworthy way to formulate impressions of the conflict in Ukraine. And most of the information that's being reported by the Western media, that is where it's coming from, right? It's not just coming from like their head offices or their editorial teams or like what the American or British governments tell them or the Ukrainian governments tell them. It's coming from this big transnational community of analysts who particularly are picking up, yes, partly on information that's been released by, say, satellite imagery by the American governments, the intelligence wiretap that was released by the German government a few months ago of Russian commanders talking about orders to kill civilians. But it also comes from the work of NGOs like Human Rights Watch on the ground, interviewing people on the ground, witnessing events on the ground, them then talking to analysts back home. So that is, I think, in general, a pretty reliable way to build up a picture of what's going on in Ukraine. And that picture is something that, as I say, outside Russian-backed media and Russian-backed sources, the picture is pretty clear that Russian forces are engaging in very, very serious atrocities in areas of the Ukraine that they occupy. There are some very, very isolated incidents of Ukrainian forces also engaging in some law of war violations, so some treatment of prisoners of war, for example, but they're much more isolated than the Russian atrocities, which are really pretty widespread at this stage. So that would be my kind of main argument to people. Like, do be skeptical of what you read, think critically about what you're engaging with. But just sort of switching over to another narrative, say like a more pro-Russian narrative, is not thinking critically, right? That's just choosing to accept one side of the story. And I would say the least trustworthy side of the story. Place your faith in international, transnational communities of research and analysts, because that's the best way that we can kind of check against, verify and falsify the kind of coverage that we get.
Now, you're kind of preaching to the choir, and I would think that most of us watching our interview would totally agree with this transnational community of analysts. However, paradoxically, since we refute our information and sometimes show that The Economist has misinterpreted something, and then The Times has misinterpreted something, this homogeneous Russian block of information that's always accurate, always true, and without any questions or without any contradictions, to the Russian people may even seem more credible, because since we know people like coherence, people like one voice, and I think what Russia created is a kind of a perfect propaganda where not only newspapers like Novaya Gazeta has been shut down, but also internet portals like, for instance, Dost, that was sent over the internet, was shut down, and all the other things. So actually, we do not hear any criticism. And the question would be, I hear you about the transnational analysts, but how about Russian people? Is there even a chance to argue to them by bringing on your arguments, even if they understood the English language? How could they be reached? Because they seem to be in a totally isolated bubble that's coherent. And from time to time, once a week, I watch those news, and there are also experts. So there are professors from different countries of the former Soviet Union. Of course, there are professors from the famous MGU, Moscow State University, or MGIMO, international faculty. You're also a lecturer of international politics in King's College London. And there would be your counterpart, maybe not Jonathan, but Jan, who is actually arguing the same thing. He argues that there are scholars, even very Soviet-like transnational scholars, who are pointing out to the fakes that the West is presenting to them. And of course, the satellite pictures are wrong. So is there even a chance to overcome this gap or this divide by having in mind that Russia actually destroyed all the alternative media in their own country?
Yeah, I mean, there is obviously a difference, first of all, between the two setups, right? Like, I mean, when I talk about the transnational community of analysts, I don't just mean kind of people that stretch across different countries, right? We're talking about, you know, the vast bulk of the world's population are in countries where these analysts are operating, as you've described. I mean, Russia would very much be pulling on a very narrow pool of it and very close allies to try and verify this. And I mean, the other major difference, of course, is that, you know, and this is the crucial point, it's not just about getting people with the name professor in front of their name up on the television, right? It's about getting people who operate in a free and open research environment where they don't face government pressure or other kinds of pressure, like big corporate pressure, for example, to produce the research that they do. We need to look for relatively independent, non-partisan, credible organizations and researchers, and that is what generally Russia is not able to provide. But I take your point, from the perspective of an ordinary Russian citizen, that is so obviously not self-evident, right? I mean, so one note I have here to say is pessimistic, right? To some extent, almost by definition, if alternative voices can't get into Russian media space, then it's very hard to counteract the dominant hegemonic narrative that the Russian government orchestrates, right? Like, we're just, you know, they're not listening to me, right? Like, they're not listening to Human Rights Watch. So, and it's not possible for us to get in there. So in that sense, no, it's not possible almost by definition. But what I would say is we need to remember that the power of propaganda is real, but it's quite uneven, right? So, my suspicion and sort of Russian experts that I know who do some research suggest that there is quite a lot of uptake of the kind of Russian propaganda narratives about the Ukrainian war, but there is also substantial constituencies in Russia who are very skeptical, or at least rather apathetic or unconvinced by these narratives, or even people who kind of support the war, but they at the same time don't trust the government. So they have a more ambivalent set of opinions. And I think that is something really important to bear in mind, that the fact that people are kind of being given only one view doesn't necessarily mean that they just mindlessly swallow that view. I'm a kind of one of the contexts. My main work is on mass atrocities, and one of the main contexts I've done work on is the Soviet Union under Stalin. Right? And Stalin's government had a totally hegemonic kind of propaganda system. And yet still, we now know that while probably most of the Soviet population did sort of accept some elements of propaganda, it was very varied, right? There were large swathes of the Russian population who didn't buy into what the communist government was saying under Stalin, particularly amongst the peasantry, which had been very victimized by Stalin's government. There was huge amounts of opposition. I would strongly suspect that, you know, most peasants did not believe what the government was saying a lot of the time. And you know, that will be mirrored to some extent in Russia today. Sectors of Russian society which are very unconvinced by Putin may, you know, selectively accept or may completely reject this propaganda rather than just swallowing it. So in the grand scheme of things, the best I think that we can do outside of the Russian kind of media environment is continue to sort of report as credibly as possible, to make the facts available, to make sure information is out there in the system, despite the fact that inevitably the Russian government calls all evidence fabrication, you know, pictures still speak louder than words, video images speak louder than pictures. And the more of these that we have available, the easier it is to kind of build the case about the reality of what is going on. But it's not easy, right? And I think again, I mean, this isn't an argument we can actually kind of go in and make to Russians necessarily, but I guess, again, I would reiterate this very simple message that people should always be asking themselves, who are you trusting, right? Where is this information and this impression that you are getting coming from? And are there some obvious reasons to distrust that information? If all the information I got about the war in Ukraine came from the British government or media controlled by the British government, I would be pretty skeptical of that information. The fact that most of the information I get on the conflict in Ukraine comes from all of this diverse kind of web of NGOs, United Nations agencies, you know, Western media, et cetera, is what gives me some confidence. So you know, you might be able to make some argument of like, look, by no means accept the Western narratives. Okay, fine, you don't trust those. Mm-hmm. You have existing beliefs that make you very distrustworthy of the West. But you can't honestly think that, you know, the Russian government has no vested interests here that might be distorting what it's saying as well. And so just encouraging a greater degree of skepticism, I think is at least something that is viable. And to some extent, I think probably just happening automatically, right? Although the Kremlin's control of the media environment is very strong in Russia, the more that time passes and the more that early statements about the war kind of don't seem like they're being manifested, the more that the war drags on, the worse economic conditions get. You may not get people embracing Western narratives, but you may get some more skepticism about the government narrative. That's, I suppose, in the sort of short to medium run, probably the best that we can hope for.
All right. And instead of asking you the next question, what kind of atrocities are taking place, maybe it's more logical to ask you what 2, 3, 4 foundations for your information, or some websites, some sources that you actually collect or that you analyze to actually make your claims of what is happening and is not happening in Ukraine. Maybe that would be more helpful, because I know that some people will comment underneath that video that whatever you tell us now is not credible, is controlled by some kind of American transatlantic corporation that nobody knows about. But still, as we know from debate, we cannot persuade all the people, but we can persuade 20, 30, 40% of our audience today. So maybe you can tell me like 2, 3 websites, newspapers, any sources that you consult to find out about what happens in Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, I consult kind of whatever we can get available that comes from any kind of moderately, you know, seriously credible sources. But there are some dominant ones. I mean, for a start, people really should put a lot of faith in United Nations reporting. The United Nations Office for Human Rights, and also the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. The United Nations is not a perfect organization, but one of its strongest and most respected features is its information gathering capabilities. Let's remember, the United Nations is not under the control of any state or government. To the degree it's controlled by any, it's control, you know, the sort of most powerful body in the United Nations is the UN Security Council, on which Russia and China both sit and have vetoes, right? This is not an organization that can go out fabricating things in America's interests, right? But it reports very accurately on what is going on in Ukraine. It currently reports, it's not even an absolute minimum, it's 5,000 confirmed civilian deaths as a result of the conflict. The UN Office for Human Rights emphasizes that that will only be a fraction of the total. So total civilian deaths are likely to be several times higher than that. And it reports on some of the events like bombardment of civilian areas by Russian forces, for example, that have resulted in those civilian deaths. So UN coverage is generally a good source of information that I would recommend people pay attention to and put a lot of faith in. Again, as a representation of the transnational community of analysts that are independent and are credible, the UN is a good kind of focal point. I would then say, I mean, other major things I would suggest are kind of important NGOs. So Human Rights Watch is a deeply respected, internationally acknowledged NGO. It's not under the control of any government. They report extensively on abuses. They have reported on abuses by both sides. Again, I would stress, and Human Rights Watch would stress, that there is, vastly more evidence of atrocities on the Russian side than the Ukrainian side, but the Ukrainians have not completely been unblemished in their behavior in the war, and Human Rights Watch reports on that. So that's another good organization. Probably another one is the International Committee of the Red Cross. Again, one of the most respected, trusted international humanitarian organizations in the world. They are mainly concerned with delivering humanitarian aid. Then they are explicitly neutral and non-partisan, so they don't lobby governments over things, but they do report to some extent on what's going on in armed conflict as well. Other organizations one could look to are somewhat more specialist organizations, for example, like Genocide Watch, which is one of the main international NGOs, again, controlled by no government, controlled by no corporation, that's responsible for reporting on potentially genocidal situations around the world. So all of these are important. I mean, again, it's very hard to cover any of this stuff without engaging with media to some extent. And again, I would emphasize to people, if you don't think you're dependent on some media for your information, then I don't know where you're getting your information from, because all of us do. The internet websites are also a form of media here and are often very unreliable. So I would tend to say the two of the most reliable, well, I'm not going to make this as a personal opinion. The two single most trusted news organizations in the world are CNN and the BBC. And there are reasons for that. They're very transnationally respected. They both operate with highly independent lines, particularly on their international coverage. Again, I wouldn't necessarily always put the BBC top of my list if it's reporting on like things in which Britain has a really strong vested stake. But in general, for international coverage, those are the two most respected organizations in most polls worldwide. And that testifies to their high kind of caliber and trustworthiness. So all of these, I would say, come together, and then there are a range of other specialist organizations that do kind of, research institutes for security studies. The main other area I get my information from, of course, is scholars, right, as independent researchers, university professors, et cetera, again, in the UK, in the US, in most Western countries, academics have very strong protections to prevent pressure and interference being placed on them from governments. You should still always check if they're being funded by or who they're being funded by. I'm not currently funded by any organization. I'm just employed by King's College London. Sometimes researchers will be funded by specific corporate interests, and you should always check if that's the case. But usually we're funded by research councils, by universities, and we are protected and allowed to do our own independent research. And if research gets published in recognized, authorized journals, that means it's been peer reviewed by other independent, again, non-governmental scholars. So that's obviously one of the most credible sources for information as well. And again, people shouldn't trust any individual source, right? They should put this all together. But there's a big difference between those kind of sources that I've just listed and the kind of conspiracy sites, news stations run directly or backed by the Russian government. Obviously, those are things that you should, in my view, not deem to be trustworthy, just like you shouldn't deem statements by the Democrats or the Republican Party in America as being like authoritative, right? Like they obviously have strong vested interests.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. I think for our community, that was pretty valuable, because for you, maybe that's common knowledge, but many people rely on certain media, national newspapers, maybe international newspapers. But what you just told us about the United Nations, that they are not quite controlled by one country, let's call them USA, because in the Security Council, there are different big players in, or the Red Cross or Human Rights Watch. Those are definitely three web pages that I will also put a link in the description that we might check out. So if we are not sure, just check out those organizations, because when you mentioned BBC, CNN, we feel, that's the West. But I think those international organizations, those are worth check them out. In the second part of the interview, Jonathan, since you have studied political science and now you're an international lecturer, of course, we all are interested which way this could be going. There are some people, very pessimistic people, who say that that could develop into something like Israel and Palestine because of those intertwined histories of those two countries that could go on for decades. Other people are maybe hopeful that some kind of agreement might be made. The simplest that I've heard of is that Ukraine promises not to enter NATO. So militarily, it's kind of neutral, but on the other hand, it can go to the European Union if European Union at the end accepts Ukraine by its criteria. So on the one hand, we have this optimistic view. On the other hand, we have this pessimistic view. From your perspective, you've read maybe not thousands, maybe thousands, but hundreds of books on international politics. Where could this lead to? And of course, we both know that you might be wrong when we both watch this interview in 1 year or 5 years.
Right.
But I think it's a quite interesting question. So why not try to answer it? Maybe you want to go for it.
Yeah, they say prediction is a foolish game, right? But as you say, I mean, it's interesting. I often think that the role of scholars such as myself is not to, as it were, make predictions, but to make forecasts. And what I mean by that, the distinction is a prediction is like, this is the thing, right, that I think is going to happen. A forecast is more like saying, here are the possibilities, right? Here's like the range of possibilities, and here are maybe some that are more likely than others. I think that's probably how I would answer your question if you don't consider that a cop-out. I think that it's obviously a very difficult question to answer. And that is in part because a huge amount depends on two key questions that we don't really have an ability to assess very well. One is, how long can the Russian military forces in particular, but to some extent Ukrainians as well, sustain the war effort in the Ukraine? There is strong suggestions at the moment from some analysts and also some government figures in the West that Russia's forces are nearing a point of real logistical crisis, running out of key resources, ammunition, significant destruction of much of their frontline hardware. And unlike Ukraine, which has an kind of in the long term almost limitless supply of backing from Europe and the United States, Russia under economic sanctions would need to replenish most of that stock itself, right? There's some question about would China give them some support. China has been quite careful so far on somewhat leaning Russia, but also being somewhat critical, or not so much critical. There's been some criticism domestically in China, but the position of the government has been veering from sort of leaning Russia to neutral. Would China kind of step up its backing for Russia? That's kind of interesting subsidiary question there. But so if the Russian military forces enter some kind of severe crisis in, say, the next 3 to 4 months, then that will significantly change the terms of the war, right? It might be possible for the Ukrainian forces to then significantly recapture some of the territory where Russian forces currently are. Strong incentives on the Russian government for some kind of like negotiated solution that would actually be quite acceptable to Ukraine. You mentioned, for example, Ukraine promising not to join NATO, but maybe even being allowed to join the EU. Maybe Putin could walk away and declare that a victory. But actually it would be acceptable to Ukraine. At the moment, I don't think the Russians would go, and I mean, there has already been some discussion of that kind of deal, and the Russians haven't really gone for it. And certainly at the moment, their main objective seemed to be to, really annex significant sections of eastern Ukraine, which they're kind of, in a de facto sense, they're already doing, and the Crimea, of course. So that's kind of one scenario, right? One scenario is actually the Russian military effort kind of collapses in the next 4 months. That one would think would create pretty strong incentives for some kind of negotiated outcome. If that's not the case, and actually the Russian forces are much more able to maintain their war effort, and let's also, again, I'm sort of assuming here that there's very little evidence that the Russians at the moment are really able to create a total breakthrough of Ukrainian lines. Even if they were, I don't think that the Russians could hold on to kind of half the Ukraine. I think there is a limit to their plausible occupation zone, but what the Russians might at most be able to do is to like very much solidify control over an expanded area of eastern and southern Ukraine. At that point, the war probably like grinds into a stalemate. But that is a stalemate that could be quite maintainable by both sides for a very long period of time. And then we might be in something much more like the Russian war in Chechnya, which when Putin kind of reinitiated that conflict, or it's sort of already been reinitiated, but in the phase of the conflict during Putin's leadership, it ran from roughly 1999 to 2009, 10 years, right? And I could imagine that we could see a very, very long-term stalemate, probably not quite that long-term, but some kind of stalemate in eastern Ukraine, potentially even ultimately resolving in something not totally dissimilar to what we have in North Korea and South Korea at the moment, right? Of a kind of ceasefire, demilitarized line, but no actual peace resolution, right? Because I can't imagine really a world in which Ukraine is ever going to be willing to sign away swathes of eastern Ukrainian territory. And if Russia isn't like seeing its war effort collapsing, then I don't really see why Russia would agree to if they're still in control of large sections of eastern Ukraine, which they're now put Russian flags over, have said that they've held referendums in and absorbed into Russia, I don't see why they would give that territory back either. So those, I think, are the two kind of main, more pessimistic and maybe, at least from a certain perspective, more optimistic, certainly from a humanitarian perspective, more optimistic predictions about the war. One might be that the Russian military effort will degrade to the point where we do see negotiations. The other, much more of a long-running stalemate. And I would say that those are the two main options there. Obviously, the long-running stalemate is a worse option, not just if you're kind of sympathetic to Ukraine or you're living in the West. It's just in humanitarian terms, that will be a lot worse, right? Again, we've seen very serious atrocities. Even if, and I see no reason to think this would occur, even if the Russian forces stopped committing atrocities or stopped engaging in indiscriminate bombardments of civilian areas in eastern Ukraine, the mere ongoing nature of the conflict in terms of refugees, economic costs, damage to the territory, inability of people to return to cities in the war zone would be really devastating, as the war has already been. So I'd say, thinking about the field of possibilities, those are the kind of two anchor points. Obviously, you might see little modifications, right, around those two kind of main courses. So maybe we see something like the stalemate, but actually it's a kind of gradual stalemate in which Russian dissatisfaction with the war builds up. Maybe Putin leaves office in 5 years, right? Maybe a new Russian government is like, look, we could get rid of these sanctions. We could end this conflict pretty easily. This is Putin's war, not our war. Maybe then there's some kind of development that goes on there. Equally, maybe Ukrainian forces are able to defeat Russian military forces more emphatically on the ground. Maybe that creates domestic problems in Russia. So there are other possibilities around these sort of two main possibilities that I've sketched. But I think that's the rough two forecasts that I would make about the war going forwards.
Yeah, and I think what we can say about the past is that everybody is surprised that Ukraine can hold off the Russians for such a long time, because at the beginning, when there was a 60-kilometer convoy going towards Kiev, and Zelensky was proposed to flee to another country, we all thought that might be over like a blitzkrieg in a few days, but it's a big surprise. And I'm personally surprised also because of the fact that the Western weapons that the West, like Germany, for instance, is promising, isn't getting delivered so fast as the Ukrainians might need that. So there is even in the German media, the discussion, is the German chancellor really willing to give them weapons as fast as he could, or is it kind of a plot where he tries to also appease Putin by giving not the best weapons and also with a little bit of delay? But that's for another discussion. But it's really interesting that Putin on the one hand claims that Ukraine is ahistoric and actually part of Russia, and we are all one and the same brotherhood of peoples, but at the second time the second brother is doing everything he can to actually fight off his first brother. So I'm really wondering why Putin isn't caught by this cognitive dissonance where he believes we're one people, but then the others really don't want to go to bed with him. But this is probably also for another debate. Jonathan, let me ask at the end of our conversation how the international community could actually help to end the war, because because you can argue that all those missiles and bombs and tanks from, let's say, Poland, let's say Britain, let's say Germany and Spain and all the other countries is actually prolonging this conflict. So you could argue that because of, you mentioned this constant stream of weapons towards Ukraine, on the other side, Putin, who doesn't want to lose his face, will also from the east, from the north, from all kinds of his big country try to pull everything to Ukraine. You could even argue that this prolongs the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. On the other side, the West doesn't want to just give away Ukraine and not help them because we are maybe morally obliged to help the smaller country to defend for its territory. So my last question to you would be, what would be a good international strategy, especially from the US and Europe? How could they help to end this tragic war?
Mm-hmm. And it's an excellent, obviously, and very important question. And I think the way you've put it is very good, because one thing I want to sort of, I think, emphasize is, for anyone who is tempted to sort of say, oh, just, withdrawal support, right, maybe that would help. I don't think that would end the war in Ukraine. What it would turn it into is an even bloodier war, because at least at the moment, we are seeing a war with a fairly conventional front line, right? The war is occurring on a zone of fighting in eastern Ukraine, largely between Russian and Ukrainian military forces, although, as I've said, there are significant atrocities against civilians going on as well. If you kind of take out a lot of the sort of support that Ukraine is getting, what you get is probably not a swift Russian victory, right? What you get is a much more extensive Russian occupation and an internal Ukrainian guerrilla insurgency, right? So it's much more like a kind of Vietnam War or the Soviet war in Afghanistan style operation. Those were not quick wars. They were even bloodier, longer, more problematic conflicts. So although, I consider myself a very anti-war person, and I'm not hugely in favor of the arms trade, but this is a context in which I think things would be even worse if Western support for Ukraine wasn't forthcoming. And also, the one other thing I want to mention is, we've mentioned a little bit about the fact that Russian forces are and have been widely verified by international organizations as committing atrocities in eastern Ukraine, and earlier than that in Bucha, when they were, as you say, making their march to Kiev, trying to occupy Kiev. Research generally suggests that the most effective way to stop atrocities is to defeat the perpetrators of those atrocities and move them out of the territory of their victims. So again, this is not just about kind of like supporting Ukraine and supporting democracy, although I think that's a potentially admirable cause, although one that the West only really does very inconsistently, I would say, but nevertheless, there's an argument to be made there. But this is also about stopping atrocities, limiting the humanitarian crisis, and also, of course, deterring Russian aggression in future. So I think those are the stakes, right? I think those are the objectives that we have to have. And I think in that, at the moment, there only is really one major valid option, which is to continue and to step up the kind of support that Western states are giving. 2 points here. One is, some people might want an even more aggressive response, right? They might be, why doesn't NATO intervene in Ukraine, or use something like a no-fly zone, right? There were calls for no-fly zones. I think that's extremely dangerous. I think by and large, the European Union and the United States and their other partners have, broadly speaking, treaded quite a careful line, to some extent, a line set by Putin here, of giving support, but not doing actions that would cross over into the area where Russia might take retaliation against the broader world, which could drag us into a NATO-Russian war. That would obviously be catastrophic. And so that needs to be avoided. Even a no-fly zone carries very strong risks of that, because you need to, at some point, enforce it. That might mean shooting down a Russian jet. That would bring NATO-Russian military forces into conflict. So stepping up military backing to Ukraine is, I think, really the only and most viable option available. What I will say here is that, as you noted, there is a lot more that the West can do in that respect. Interestingly, the biggest contributors at the moment by proportion of GDP, obviously America is the biggest contributor in total, right? But by proportion of GDP is not Germany or Britain or America, it's Estonia and Poland and the Baltic states, right? So there's a lot more that, as you say, countries like Germany and France in particular, but to some extent also Britain and other European states could do here. And one really important challenge that they're going to have is that if, as I say, analysts are right to think that the Russian military machine is gradually being degraded, it's not accelerating its operational abilities, it's actually declining in its operational capabilities, then at some point the Ukrainians will need military assets that actually allow them to target what are now entrenched Russian forces. So that means like longer range unarmed drones that can carry missiles into occupied territory and target entrenched tanks or artillery units. Possibly there's been big calls for the HIMARS rocket launch system. So now all of this, people need to think about the post-war conflict at some point, right? What are we going to do with these assets after the war? Are we just going to leave Ukraine with this very, very extensive Western military hardware? I don't know. I'm not sure what states' plans are for that at the moment, and I think that needs thinking about. But if, as I say, there is a very strong humanitarian and geopolitical case for trying as far as possible to push Russian forces out of Ukrainian territory, and that will require more military support and financial support, and also, most importantly, actually of all, humanitarian support from the West to kind of limit the damage. So there's just a lot more that can be done, I would say, in those three areas: military, financial, and humanitarian, and all other options are pretty unattractive.
All right, Jonathan, I think it became pretty clear for our viewers that you're not only an expert, but also a very good person who explains things so well that I think I would even have understood our interview when I was in 10th grade. And I mean it as a compliment because it's lots of clarity and lots of structure in what you do. That's not a coincidence. You have been in your student years one of the best debaters in the world. But let's maybe not focus on that, but focus more on your research. Is there maybe a website or where people can read more about you, maybe also what you've written on Ukraine, or generally something that we could lead some of the interested people towards to?
Yes, I mean, the main thing would be my website. So that's jleadermaynard.com. Maybe we can put a link under this video. I've just completed my first book, which is on ideology and mass atrocities. Again, anyone who thinks that I'm a kind of just general apologist for the West, well, one of the main cases I talk about in that book of mass killing is the area bombing of Germany and Japan by America and Britain in World War II. So people might find that interesting. But yeah, my website would be the main place to look at. You can also, I mean, if you allow me to finish on an interesting point, I think going back to our very initial question that you asked, you can see who I work for, right? I also have a King's College London website. I'm a recognized and accredited academic there. Again, a lot of people who publish work as kind of, you know, top experts in their field, they have a personal website, but they don't have any other website that allows you to actually trace who they work for or who's funding them or things like that. So people could check out my website on King's College London, or as I say, my personal website, which is jleadermaynard.com. I try as far as possible to make a lot of my work freely available. Obviously, some of it is for academic journals that charge, or you have to access them through a university library. But I try where I can to put free copies of my writing available on my website. So if people go to jleadermaynard.com, they can, there's a page called Publications, and you can scroll down there and see both the sort of more academic writing I've done and the writing for a more general audience as well.
Yeah, great stuff, Jonathan. Thanks a lot for the interview. And for us viewers, Jonathan told us that we need to be skeptical. So let's check him out and see if he's a really credible source. That is what he said at the beginning. And I think it's generally a good idea not only to have a .com page, but also to be a lecturer like Jonathan is at the International College. Now, since it's YouTube, it's not just a dialogue of two people. I would invite you, dear listener, to comment on what we have talked about. Where were you convinced? Where do you have additional questions? Where is maybe you have a better argument that we shouldn't trust A, B, or C? Put it please in the comments so we have a really enriched discussion. And Jonathan and I will, as much as we can, answer or at least read your comments. Of course, be as much to the point as possible. And I'm looking forward to what you, dear listener, have to say. And Jonathan, once again, thanks a lot for the interview and for taking the time. Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye.